people are filtering in and muting their cameras and getting comfortable in that. Delighted again to welcome you all back to the, I think this is the 10th installment maybe of the Economy and Society Summer School. And we're delighted on this occasion to welcome Evelyn Brodkin, who's traveled all the way from Chicago to see us here on Zoom. And she's giving a paper today on street level welfare politics, understanding the state at the street level. So this is especially in conjunction with Joe Whelan and Mary Murphy, who are also joining us to give a response and questions after Evelyn's presentation. Just get us kicked off, and then we'll open to the floor for questions and answers in general. So at any point in the talk, feel free to put a question into the chat for everyone, or to raise your hand once I suppose, once the presentation has gone through at any rate. So there we are, and I think we're all ready to go. So Evelyn, over to you to start the ball rolling. Thanks very much.
Great, thank you so much. And I'm really pleased to be with all of you today. I wish we could be sitting around in the same room together, but we will make do with sitting in our Zoom room. And I really have to thank Tom and Ray for organizing this amazing series and inviting me to participate, and to Joe and Mary for joining me in what I hope will be a conversation among all of us about street level welfare politics. What do I mean by street level? I assume some of you are quite well versed in this field and others may be less familiar. So I'm going to try to walk a balance between too much and too little, but I hope you'll all join in the chat and conversation and ask questions, which I'm happy to respond to later. So what are street level organizations? Well, street level organizations are those organizations that bring policy directly to people. And let me ask you just to sit and think for a minute about what street level organizations you may be in contact with in your everyday life. If we were in the room, I'd be watching you. But think of it as if I am. Are you in contact with street level organizations? Perhaps you even work in one. Who are they? They're the organizations that bring policy to people. We're familiar with that definition. They also are the operational arm of the state. They're responsible for implementing many tasks that the state does. But they're also, these days, not entirely state actors. We have street level organizations that are public and private, nonprofit, for-profit, hybrid. All of them are engaged in bringing social programs, policies, and other state activities. They're especially important because they're the spaces in which ordinary people, and especially marginalized individuals, are likely to encounter the state. They're more likely to be in the schools, encounter the cops, get vaccinated in health clinic, than they are to encounter the prime minister, be in the halls of parliament, or in the upper reaches of the ministry. This is where most of us routinely encounter the state. So how do street level organizations matter to welfare politics? As noted, they're more than mere policy implementers. They are also understood as mediators of welfare state policy and politics. What do I mean by that? What they do on the ground every day is what the policies become, not what's written on the page. And politics is what I'm going to discuss for the most part in this conversation. They are political, not as advocates or overtly, but they're political in effect through their everyday activities, because it's these activities that indirectly determine, so important, I've written it twice, who gets what, when, and how. They are tasked with a responsibility for addressing social needs and problems. And this places them in a space that's often deeply conflicted. because our policies, what we should do, who gets what, are deeply conflicted. What happens in these spaces, why, and to what effect, are key questions for street-level research and theory. Different scholars at different times will focus on different elements of this larger story. Today, I want to talk mostly about the street-level politics. In this space, the political conflicts are not overt like they are in legislatures, elections, the judiciary, but they take place indirectly as street-level organizations, in a sense, make policy through their practices. An example I like to give is in the field of child welfare, where many countries have laws that say the first responsibility of child welfare agencies is to protect the well-being of the child and save them from dangerous circumstances or harmful circumstances. But they also tend to have language that says they should protect the family and maintain family relations. Well, sometimes these two objectives are in conflict. What is the policy in everyday life? Does it veer toward protecting the child, perhaps taking them out of the home, or to working with the family? These are the kinds of lower level decisions that street level practitioners deal with much of the time, although they don't necessarily think of it as such. So the street level approach, in brief, it's a research strategy and an analytic strategy that takes investigation beyond what welfare state policies say to examine what they do in everyday organizational life. It recognizes that although the formal policies certainly matter, they are often not definitive. Under those circumstances, the law is more what my colleague Jean-Claude Barbier has called a political referentiel, or a cognitive frame that deploys vague generalities to mask the potential divergent realities. And I will come back to this idea of divergent realities, which I think is quite smart. The objective is to investigate how street level organizations construct these divergent realities on the ground, what they are, what they do, and their consequences. Street level organizations are also political in the sense that they structure possibilities for voice, claims making, resistance, status, trust. Think again, if you're a parent who has children in schools, what do you push for? What claims are you making on the state when you say, my child needs special reading help? Or, you know, we need to have a music program in my school. These are a form of claims on the state. Not the most contentious of them, although anyone who studies school politics will assure you they are. But these are simply simple examples. When is a street level approach most useful? I think it's most useful for investigating the state's response to sticky problems. What are sticky problems, you may ask? Sticky problems are problems that are politically contested and difficult to fully resolve through formal or visible means. Think of if you had a nice pastry this afternoon at tea. What are the sticky bits that are left afterwards on your fingers that don't quite disappear and that you still have to deal with? Although these policy conflicts may be manifestly resolved through authorized institutions, the laws themselves tend to require compromise, including multiple objectives, obfuscation. In this sense, they leave the sticky bits behind in what Barbier called fuzzy generalities, the ambiguous or conflicting legal provisions, framework laws, which are very common in the Nordic countries, the delegation of discretion. This is where the sticky bits remain. Well, not a pretty picture when they do. When they do, these sticky problems are, in a sense, delegated down to the street level organizations that have to perform the tasks of delivering policy and implementing the law. In these circumstances, it's appropriate to think of street-level organizations as sites for continuing political conflicts by other, nominally non-political means. It's a lot said here, but I'm happy to direct you where you can read more about this in some detail. So I thought one way to make this live is to give you a brief example, and one that I think is most in line with the kinds of conversations you've been having over this series. And that is studying the state at the street in the case of Workfare. What is the sticky problem? Well, there are many, but the large macro problem is adjusting the boundaries between work and welfare. Esping Anderson might regard this as the extent to which the state commodifies citizenship is another way to think about it. And of course, another way to think about it is it involves the distribution of income, who gets what, when, and how. This is a subject we took up in a book I co-edited, Work in the Welfare State, that intended to move beyond ideological assumptions or policy on the page to investigate workfare policy as produced. And just to be sure we're all understanding what I mean by workfare, workfare goes by many names: labor market activation programs, a whole range of programs that in one way or another link participation in work or work activities to the provision of social benefits. With my colleagues, we investigated how workfare took shape on the ground in 6 countries: US, UK, Denmark, Germany, Netherlands, and Australia. By examining the on-the-ground practice, we wanted to illuminate the ways in which street-level welfare changed the boundaries between work and the welfare state. What were the divergent possibilities? One possibility, according to the law, is that workfare, or labor market activation, which sounds better somehow, would be a policy that enabled people to work, that provided skills and training and opportunities, and essentially a path that would bring people into the labor market in ways that they could live a decent life. And I think most of us would likely think this is rather a good idea. But another possibility, also embedded in the policy, was workfare as a regulatory effort, one that pushed people into the labor market in ways that did not work to their advantage, that pushed them into MIC jobs or dead-end work or low-wage contingent labor that did not provide the possibilities for a decent life, or that simply used workfare processes to push them off benefits and into poverty, which, to cut to the end, is more or less what happened in the US. So these conflicts over the commodification of citizenship, social welfare obligations of the state to its citizens, and the boundary of state and market are embedded in the policy. And the question is, which of these divergent realities occur on the ground? What we discovered across countries that had somewhat different policies and different arrangements, but we discovered a parallel track of managerial reforms that structured the conditions of street-level work in ways that produce systematic biases in the provision of welfare on the ground. And these biases were not made visible by administrative metrics. As a general matter, these managerial strategies made it more likely for those working at the street level to favor practices that were related to regulation rather than enabling. And these, it's important to say, practices occur independent of an individual's personal or professional preferences. And I will try to get back to this because it's a really important point. What one sees in street level research is people thinking they believe one thing and doing another. They think, oh, I want to help these poor people. And then they tangle them up in paperwork so they lose their benefits. When you see these discontinuities, you ask, why is this happening? And it's here that the managerial strategies and the organizational conditions and pressures help you understand these discontinuities. And this is what we saw, the hidden power of these practices moving toward a more regulatory approach to welfare, although, of course, it varied in different countries. They started in a different place, they ended in a different place, but the tendencies across them were similar. So some quick examples of how these forms of governance reach the street. Who is caught in the middle? The guy with the glasses? He's your street level worker, buffeted on one side by the demands of the clients for help, and on the other side by demands of management to meet performance metrics, be efficient, pay attention to the stuff that gets measured. One thing that I saw, I spent a couple years embedded in Chicago welfare offices where I did organizational ethnographic work to understand how street level workers experience these conditions and what they did. And for those of you who haven't done this kind of work, I recommend it. It's absolutely fascinating, but it does take a long time. I saw common adaptations, performance measures, how quickly they got through their cases. So they developed adaptations that allowed for speed over need. One caseworker I saw showed me how she maximized efficiency. She pulled out of her desk drawer a stack of personal, individual, tailor-made assessments for the day's clients that had all been filled out in advance before she saw them. She was efficient. The administrative metrics say she got the job done. No one knows how she did it. And second, and this is Mary's favorite, I often use as an example the case of Mr. Frank, who was a street level bureaucrat extraordinaire. And I followed Mr. Frank for a week in a Chicago welfare office, not to see the worst that could happen, but to see the best. He was the most highly rated worker in the office, routinely. And when I asked the manager, who should I see to understand how well you do this work? She said, go see Mr. Frank. So for the record, I wasn't stacking the deck to look for problems. I tried to stack it in the other direction to see how managers thought things worked best. You can read about this, I think, in one of the papers we distributed, as well as in my book. But Mr. Frank reached the highest level in all the performance rankings, month after month. He had learned to maximize efficiency by scheduling all his clients to come in at 9 o'clock in the morning, even though obviously he couldn't see them all at 9. And that meant they waited, he didn't, which is a small thing, unless you're a single mom and you've got to get the kids to school, pick them up from childcare, etc. It can be a little complicated to think that waiting time is costless, but waiting time doesn't show up in performance metrics. Mr. Frank also had a wonderful strategy for doing his personal individualized assessments of people's work needs. The week I was there, he sent nearly every one of his clients to the same program. Well, that's interesting. Could they all benefit from the same program? And I asked him. And he said, oh, don't worry, I send them all to the best program. What is the best program? Well, he explained, this is a really good program because they get their paperwork to me on time. Of course, one could say maybe that meant they were very well organized, or maybe it just happened to make his job of meeting his metrics a little easier. And what was this program? Well, it was a program that nearly every client hated. It was a work off your benefits program that required people in it to spend their days in the park picking up garbage and dog droppings. And they would ask him in their meetings, I'd really like to get into a training program. I'd like to be a truck driver. I'd like to be a plumber. I'd like to be a teacher's aide. And Mr. Frank would say, no, you go to this program first. And if you prove yourself to me by doing well in it, then I'll consider you for another program, which he really did. And if you don't, then what? Well, if you don't, you're not complying with Workfare rules and I'll cut your benefits. So I asked him about this later and he said, you know, it's not like I want to cut people's benefits. When I started, I just felt terrible. I pictured these little children without food. He said, then I thought, well, it's them or me. Now, I'm not saying all workers responded as Mr. Frank did. In fact, they didn't. There were efforts at resistance. There were efforts to help selected clients. But what Mr. Frank shows you is the calculus of choice, how caseworkers in an environment that maximized efficiency, meeting metrics for putting people into activities of any kind, or simply pushing them off the welfare rolls, and metrics that were indifferent to whether you gave people anything helpful or whether you made their lives worse or whether you even illegally cut them off the rolls. In that context, one can understand a tendency to do what's easiest and what's rewarded. And that's what Mr. Frank did exceptionally well, sadly. So how do SLOs matter? A street-level approach makes visible these otherwise invisible processes through which the state responds to deeply conflicted social problems. In this case, incrementally, but indirectly, shifting the boundaries between work and the welfare state. Beyond the policy itself and beyond, of course, the profound issues for the people harmed by these policies, there are also implications for democracy, because how do you challenge what you cannot see? Street-level politics are deeply problematic. I will simply mention, because I said I would talk for only 20 minutes and I'm there, in my current research, I'm applying a street-level perspective to a study of asylum policy, looking at the response to the European refugee crisis with my colleagues Karen Bredell and Stefan Hoyer. Is asylum a sticky problem? Yes. It raises difficult challenges for welfare state politics. It raises issues of humanitarianism versus security, inclusion versus exclusion, cultural homogeneity versus diversity and change, among others. We look at the response on the ground from the level of the state where the formal policies are made to the levels of the street where administrative arrangements and informal organizational practices shape the realities, the divergent realities of asylum and its lived experience on the ground. Because it's a study of welfare state politics, we chose to focus on two advanced welfare states, Sweden and Denmark, which respectively received the first and fifth highest number of asylum seekers per capita in Europe during the high period of the refugee crisis. Germany received more people, but Sweden was higher per capita. And it's a collaborative project located at the University of Chicago, my university, Aalborg University, and the University of Gothenburg. Summing up, and I'm happy to talk about this in conversation. Street-level organizations are more than mere policy implementers, although implementation is extremely important. But they also should be understood as mediators of policy and politics. They shape policy's divergent realities and its lived experience. They also structure the relationship between the governed and the governed, although they do this in ways that are difficult to see, that may seem non-political on their face, and in fact may be non-political in intent, if not in effect. If democracy requires constant interaction between the government and the governed, And democracy, as Rosenvallon has argued, requires that these activities be legible and transparent. Then political shifts that occur through street-level politics, through the non-transparent activities of street-level organizations, present a problem for democracy. As I suggested, how do you challenge what you can't see? To the extent that street-level research helps bring visibility to the hidden corners of the welfare state, it makes the state more legible and transparent, and I think is a worthy effort. Thank you for listening, and let's talk. I turn it over to you.
Can I just invite, thank you very much, Evelyn, that was delightful. And can I invite Joe and Mary, who I think has joined us, to just jump in first with responses.
Do you want to go first, Joe?
I don't mind, Mary. It's up to you.
Yeah.
You can go
I don't
ahead.
mind. There you go. Yeah, I don't mind.
Okay. So firstly, thanks, Evelyn, for that excellent and fascinating presentation. I've got copious notes written down here, so I'll try to summarize it in a way that makes some bit of sense. Thanks also to Tom and Ray for asking me to be a part of this. It's kind of funny how things shake out. I remember a number of years ago, as a postgraduate student, I was supposed to attend the Economy and Society summer school, and for one reason or another it didn't happen. So to be kind of here and to be somewhat part of the ticket in a very minor way is definitely kind of a little bit mind-blowing for me. So it's great to be here, and to be on a ticket with Evelyn and with Dr. Mary Murphy makes it even more mind-blowing. So you know, I do appreciate being here. I suppose in my response, I'd like to maybe walk back a little bit from the Workfare to maybe consider street-level work as a research lens, and to maybe consider what the value is, or what it brings in terms of what it can do that other research lenses maybe can't, and then to maybe also consider how that might be problematic depending on the jurisdiction you're working in. So I suppose I see street-level research as researching up in a way that perhaps working with service users is not. But it's not researching fully up. It's not researching up as far as policy makers. It's researching up maybe one rung on the ladder as far as policy implementers. Now, I know that you have made it very clear that street-level workers are more than just the implementers of policy, but nevertheless, they have a role in interpreting and implementing policy. And I suppose work carried out in the street-level tradition then has the potential to catch that which maybe gets lost between the two, between the policy makers and those on the front lines who are tasked with implementing policy. And it shows us then how the street-level perspective has been able to reveal how scripted policy, which is written in a certain way, in reality often manifests quite differently, and is something very different in practice. And I suppose I'm kind of tempted to think of kind of simulacra and simulation here, as in the copy becomes the reality eventually. I suppose from my own perspective as a researcher in this space, one of the biggest issues that we would face if we wanted to do street-level work in Ireland would be gaining access, being able to enter state agencies to carry out ethnographic work. It's pretty much a closed shop. So, you know, completing street-level work with people who are actually accessing services is possible, and there's potential to do it. And I know that colleagues here have done it, and I've done some myself. But if you wanted to enter a state agency in an ethnographic capacity and carry out research, that could be potentially very problematic. I know that colleagues will have tried to do that in the past and will have not have been successful. So I wonder, maybe when you're responding to me, Evelyn, if you could talk a little bit about how you found that piece of negotiating access, because I think there's something in that we could find very valuable as we attempt ourselves to do this kind of work. The other thing I maybe wanted to address was the idea of discretion. So the fact that the street level bureaucrat is tasked with interpreting and delivering policy, and within that there is the potential for discretion. In fact, discretion is kind of part and parcel of how they go about their daily work. And yet we see a move away from discretionary practices in street level work, more and more towards kind of computer technology, which takes the discretion out of street level work. And, you know, there's been some papers on this recently about how, you know, data is fed into a computer and decisions are reached, and it takes the human discretion element out of it. So I also wondered maybe if that's something you've come across in your research, and what you think the implications of that might be. Because discretion can, of course, be something negative in the sense that it's the wielding of power by somebody over somebody else, but it can also be incredibly positive, where people are able to kind of see those sticky problems that you've described and address them in a way that's appropriate. So those are kind of the two things that I wanted to maybe address. And then finally, to kind of maybe take it back to Lipsky's original kind of seminal work, which I know you've addressed and taken up in your own work. And, you know, you identified in your own review of his work that he had kind of two projects. One was an analytical project to use the street level view as a tool for analysis. And the other was a project of improvement, so to use the street level view as a project for improvement. So I suppose my final question to you then would be, what currency or what's the value of street level work? Does it get taken up by policymakers? Is it seen as being valuable by those that are tasked with making policy, or does it become a bit of an academic kind of a pursuit that doesn't in fact then go on to influence the policy in the way that you perhaps would hope that it would? So that's me. I'm not going to say any more, and hopefully that all made sense. And thank you again, Evelyn, for your presentation.
Tom, do you want me to, I could, you know, we could have this conversation. Each of these questions is a long conversation and I love them.
Sure, go for the back and forth. It's much
okay. I'm just going to be brief about some of it, but I'm reminded on the question of discretion, Joe. Oh, I don't know, 50 years ago, maybe longer, Joel Handler, who did some of the most beautiful work in this field, I think. He was testifying before Congress over welfare reform, might have been in the 60s or 70s. I don't know, I found the old testimony. And he said, you know, given the way discretion works, you know, in these welfare offices, it's really terrible what it does to people and oppressive, he said. But given what is likely to happen if we take it away, perhaps we should keep them chaotic and ill-managed, and at least there will be some spaces of possibility for resistance. And that has come back to me so many times. So when you mention digitalization, I think of Joel. Again, it affects where you're looking. Some kind benefits transfers are more likely to be subject to that than, say, asylum. So a comparative perspective on street level organizations analytically is kind of useful in thinking about that. But I'll leave that comment there for the moment. There's much more one could say. In terms of access, and we talked about, a few of us talked about this. I talked about this with Joe and Mary last week, and the difficulties of doing this work in Ireland. And access is a serious issue. Of course, if you can't get access, you can't do it. And you look for second best strategies. In my own research, I had done work like this in Boston and then in Chicago and some other cities. And it took me 2 years to get access to Chicago welfare offices. 2 years.
Yeah. Wow.
Which was grudging. It's always grudging at the top. When you're in there, people are so grateful that someone from the outside just wants to know what their lives are like, because no one knows, no one realizes, and they are they are almost desperate, many of them, to talk to you. I find this in my asylum research, especially. They thank me for coming. My obligations feel quite high, I gotta say. But if you can't get past that first hurdle of the upper level not letting you in, then you have to find other ways. And, you know, I know you've done some of this. If you can do survey research with caseworkers, or you can interview the people who've had these experiences and get at least their perceptions of what goes on. But if you can't get in, you can't get in. One of the things I mentioned was how astonishing it's been to work in my current project in Denmark and Sweden, where pretty much the answer is always yes, of course, come. Very different from the US and it seems from Ireland. So that is an issue. And finally, the last quick thing, but I think we should bring Mary in on this, the question of the analytic project versus the project of improvement, and does anyone care? And I think I'd really love to get Mary's point of view on this. You know, as an academic in the role I take, I think my job is to learn these things and make them as widely available as I can. And if in the politics of the moment, I did a piece once about how research is then used or not used politically, looking at the early workfare studies. There's usually some group who's going to be interested, and you're providing it. You're providing it. Now there's a role for advocacy researchers as well. That's another role. Or, you know, and I always offer to come back to the organizations I study and share what I've learned if they're interested. Funny, they didn't ask me back to the Chicago welfare offices. I don't know why. But Mary, I'd love to hear what you think about this.
Yeah, thank you very much to both of you, and to Tom and Ray, of course. I love it, Evelyn. So I think your work has been profoundly influential and has really left its mark in Ireland, actually, since you first visited us not so few years ago. But it actually struck me when you were talking about the speed over need and good old Mr. Frank. I feel like a little Mrs. Frank today, to be honest with you, because I've got 150 scripts to correct, and I'm going to go with speed over need, and I'm going to use every trick in the book to make it look like I did more correcting and more feedback and more, you know, we all play this game, and I think recording our own practice as internal ethnographers, is there such a word, might be quite interesting. And I know why that, like, the number of students has gone up in Irish universities 37% since 2008. The budget has gone down and the number of academic staff has remained stable. So I know why I need to go with speed over need, and I don't need to beat myself up about it. But I think none of us talk to each other about what we're doing in our practice that is deeply political in managing the reality of the lack of investment and the cuts in education. So I think there is a lot to be said there. I think that question about analytic or improvement, I think, is really important. Joe also asked about, you know, is it seen as valuable? And I think the very fact that they won't allow access is proof to me that, yes, it's seen as valuable. You know, if they go to that much trouble not to let you see something, they know that they don't want you to see it. And it may not be a very conscious knowledge, but there's a gut reaction there that says, I can't let them in there. This would blow the thing apart. I think it's potentially very epistemic disobedience, if you like, comes to mind in terms of really creating a counter knowledge that could be quite powerful. And I think some of the work that people like Peter Beresford have done in the service users movement in the UK around people with disabilities, and they creating their own knowledge of how they experience services and what goes really on in those relationships, has actually been quite powerful in reframing how things are understood. So I think that's deeply political in itself. So I would have little doubt that it's powerful knowledge. And I think there are real problems with getting people to engage with it, simply because often we don't get in enough to tell the real story. So sometimes I get told, oh, if you knew what was really going on, you know, like, okay, you captured 10%, but you didn't capture what I'm really doing, or you didn't get that story, or, you know, so they know that we're only playing with the edges of some things. and they let us play in some ways a little bit, knowing that they won't give us the full pitch to play on. So I think there is real issues about access, and I think it's actually a problem. You know, I mean, I think it's a problem that the Irish Research Council needs to take on more fully with the state in terms of access, because I think Ireland is particularly poor in that respect. But one of the other issues I wanted to raise in that, because it's something that surprised me as a researcher, and it shouldn't have, it was about my own unconscious biases to some degree. But I really love in the research the shift from the street level bureaucrat, which assumes it is a state actor a lot of the time, to taking into account privatisation, the concept of a street level organisation. And in Ireland, we have a long history of non-government organisations being the shadow state, if there was shadow welfare state. So our street level bureaucrats are often found in the NGO sector, and particularly the charity sector, who tend to take on the big delivery roles in areas like migration and homelessness and disability, mental health, and care generally. And their practice is really, really interesting to observe as well. And that's somewhere where you can get access a little bit easier in Ireland. But often what you find is, somebody described it to me, I was arguing with them about whether homeless services were better delivered by non-government organisations, the state or the private sector. And it was put to me quite forcefully, what's worse when the driver is profit maximisation or ego maximisation? And I just thought, wow, I need to go away and think about that. I really liked it. I really thought, wow, there's heaps embedded in that question about what the underlying ideologies are of the service delivery actors, be they in the NGO, the private sector or the state, and how much we need to problematise all of that. I thought particularly my own experience in I did get access to homeless services for homeless families, and the level of deep paternalism that was embedded in the street level delivery was very significant in terms of framing people's rights, people's access to power, knowledge, information, and it was a deeply political act to deliver the services the way they did, and certainly kept people in a state of disempowerment, in my opinion. So I think there's a loads that we can do, even with the boundaries to access that we have to experience in our day-to-day life. The only other thing just wanted to, I suppose, to give a rec to is, and Joe was very modest there and didn't talk about it, but you know, the research that's happening in Ireland now that's capturing some of that street level knowledge, I think is really important. Joe's own research at the moment, Nuala Whelan's research, which tried to capture, you know, what the tensions are for some NGOs trying to deliver activation policies in a context of a more regulatory environment, and some of the practices that they do to try and give enabling services in the context of a regulatory regime. Some really interesting lessons there. Philip Finn's work looking at what workers do when they're caught in a regulatory environment and they try not to regulate. So they try to be passive about the regulation or to do very light levels of enablement, but that leaves the claimants feeling just as let down in some respects. He called his PhD the unbearable lightness of conditionality. And it was that sense that he found the workers who were trying to protect him from the worst bits of conditionality left him with nothing on the other hand. So a sort of a really interesting dynamic going on at the street level. And then Michael McGann's work, who's here on a Marie Curie, looking at that double activation, twin track parallel managerial reforms embedding their own biases. And right now there's a tender out to privatise, to further privatise public employment services in Ireland. And we already see the expectation that they've moved from a costed package to a cost bid package, where you have to bid on the basis of cost, which leads you to drive down your costs. So we can see that the NGO sector will now have to bid for what were grants on a cost bidding basis. And that will definitely lead, you know, inevitably into managerial reforms and biases. So I'm really interested in how privatisation embeds itself into these new forms as well. But there's so much in all you've given us. So just to say thank you sincerely. Yeah.
Right. But I think your point about these different forms is really important. And one of the things we've done in the Asylum Project is we've tried to compare private for-profit, nonprofit, and public organizations. And I'll tell you a little inside thing. I thought they would be really, really more different than they turn out to be, which tells you something about the conditions that Mary's talking about that now seem to, they are different, but not in the ways I thought. So I think it's great
Yeah,
to
there's something in
have
that.
that.
Yeah. Thank you.
So some questions building up. Sometimes they come straight to me for some, and so thanks very much to Evelyn, Mary, and Joe. We've a question coming in from Pat Gallagher, and then Zach Roach, and from Kenny in the sites. These are all aficionados of this area. I'll just read Kenny's out first, and then we'll go to the next one via the mic. Or Kenny, if you're able to turn on your mic. Sometimes we have tech problems here.
I have children running around, but sure, you might get to meet them. Firstly, again, thanks for coming to talk to us, and it was a really interesting talk. And I suppose to kind of gloss over and talk about the Irish example, as well, you probably know we're quite a small society, and if you're researching a particular institution, or if you're researching a particular type of institution, it can be very difficult to kind of anonymize who it is you're talking to. So I was just wondering what kind of strategies you'd use for anonymizing, or if you've ever seen kind of fears of people to talk to you because there could be professional scrutiny perhaps, or maybe even kind of negative career outcomes for, like, if they don't believe they're going to be anonymized.
I think that's a really good question. And, you know, in any of these areas, the policy circles are very small. So outsiders won't know, but insiders would know. And it's something that I've worried about a lot. And of course, I don't know if you have the same, we have human subjects reviews. So I have a little conversation with anyone I interview about their choices and whether they want to talk to me and how I may use it, and they can change their minds. But the fact is, of course, I have such a volume of research data that actually, so anonymizing hasn't been such a big problem. It is at the managerial level, and I don't always, I sometimes tell the managers, look, you know, even if I don't use your name, people will know who you are. Is that okay? And they usually say yes. And if they don't, I can't use it. So, but at the street level, it's a lot easier because my ends are usually big enough. But I do worry about it, and you're right to worry about it. And I think, you know, I can protect them up to a point. But given the extent to which practitioners and managers and policymakers don't exactly pore over my research, it hasn't been an issue outing anybody. They don't read it with that level of care. But I think you're right to have that concern. There isn't a simple answer. Sometimes you may want something on background, and, you know, like Mary's suggesting, you want to say, this is part of the research. People are concerned about revealing this information, and be transparent in your work. This is what I had to do to protect them, or this is what I can't say because. I think that becomes a finding.
Interesting. Can we bring in, great stuff, can we bring in Pat Gallagher?
Tom, hi Evelyn, and thanks for a fascinating presentation. Thoroughly enjoyed it. So just a quick question about, like, in your data, you focus extensively on countries like the US and the Scandinavians, which kind of have the Protestant ethic. Do you think that street level organizations respond to instrumental systems and metrics and rules differently in elsewhere in other countries?
Good question. Of course, so the rules and the way they're used are always somewhat different. But basically, I didn't present it here, but I came up with this little equation. I don't know, it may be in one of the articles I sent, I don't remember. A calculus of choice, a calculus of discretionary choice. And basically, to the extent you look at the resources that are available to respond to demands, the level of demands, and then the incentive structure, which means everything. It's a really big I there, because it's the performance measurement, it's all the informal rewards, it's the peer influences, it's preferences, all of those things go into the mix. So to the extent that any of those are different, you will expect a somewhat different kind of response. But I'd actually like to suggest some of you might be interested in the work of colleagues of mine in Denmark are doing. Flemming Larsen and Dorte Caswell, and they've actually been working with municipalities to change the way street level workers are able to do their jobs. And they literally bring the research to them and work with them on it. And it's maybe only in Denmark. But it's a very interesting project, and I think it's a way of seeing the possibilities of applying some of this knowledge in a very practical way. And
can I just say, they're speaking at a conference in Maynooth on the 14th of May.
Oh, perfect. Okay,
but they're not coming, but they're speaking at the conference.
They're fabulous. Everybody go listen.
Details. I'll put the details into the chat, actually. Yeah.
Okay. Fantastic. I'm on the advisory board to the project, but aside from, and I've written with Flemming, but aside from that, I followed this project pretty closely, and it's quite novel and really interesting to see this application. And that just reminded me of the earlier point that was raised. You know, there's how can you use this? One of the things I try to teach my students is you can't necessarily, your choices will be constrained in practice. But to the extent you see them, you see what's going on, and you can be a reflective practitioner, you may, you know, find ways to resist, affect, change what is going on. So I think there are ways individuals, and Lisa Dodson wrote about moral undergrounds and how they form. Again, let's not, you know, I'm not going to understate the extent to which the constraints and opportunities are structured in, but knowledge opens opportunity, I hope.
So we've many comments, and it's hard to discern the comments from the questions. I'm just going to go to mispronounce this, but Huai Xiang, if that's correct. Would you like to come in with this question, because it's very important, it seems on.
Hello, hi, thank you very much for the lovely talk and the really interesting conversation. I'm quite new to kind of this part of academic theory, I suppose, and I guess I've done quite a bit of qualitative research in the past, and the thought is to do with kind of the sort of data that speaks to street level bureaucracy and kind of analyses. So I guess I just wondered, you know, is it important in the first instance to have action-based data, in the sense that behavioral scientists might talk about action, for instance? And I guess, as you could probably see relating to the question, this brings the issue of kind of how multiple or sort of univocal we would sort of have our data in some sense, in terms of what is important to supporters in theorizing in this way.
That's a really good question, and I'm going to give an answer that's far, far, far too brief to be satisfactory. I can tell you now.
Be helpful.
Yeah, but I think there are different kinds of data that emerge from, at least from the way I do the organizational ethnographic work, and there's a symposium in the journal PS, Political Science, some years ago that I and others contributed to, where we wrote about the possibilities for this kind of research and what you can learn from it. So, you know, now that is not action research in the sense of advocacy research, if that's what you're referring to, because I
not for this question. It's more sort of, you know, we're documenting actions or units of action.
Yeah, that's what I thought you meant. My ideal is to be able to embed myself in organizations and do interviews, observations, and then look at other kinds of administrative data and triangulate among them, because that's where you find, when you find the things that don't fit, that's what you go investigate. Why is it showing high rates of people leaving welfare, but what I see on the ground doesn't look like it's helping them? And then people say, so, okay, I've got to stay there until I understand this. It is a very qualitative process, but one can't always do that. So sometimes one relies with less observation and more interviews, but we do them in site, for example, in the asylum process, because I can't embed myself in Denmark and Sweden, just practically speaking.
Sure.
So there are different ways to emphasize it. Again, getting back to the conversation with Pat, I think the point when you're doing this work is to be transparent about how you're doing it and what you can see and what you can't, what it tells you and what it may not. That's, I wish more quantitative researchers did that.
Yeah, good point. Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you.
Is that helpful? It's not enough.
I think it does. Yeah, it's obviously like a big topic, and that helps. That helps.
Yeah. All right, do it. Go do it. It's messy. It takes a leap of faith. It's more, I tell my students, this is an art, but you fit it into a science.
I guess what you were saying about following through the, I suppose, the gaps or incoherences is what I was sort of taking away from that point. And then actually the process of sticking with that as far as you're able in your fieldwork conditions as maybe a very fruitful kind of lead, if you like, is sort of what I was taking away from it for that productive insights and things that sort of go beyond the kind of descriptive, right?
Exactly.
Things that may be obvious and descriptive.
Make good use of counterfactuals.
Yeah.
You know, it's so easy to be facile with this stuff. Oh, they did this because. So you always want to ask yourself, well, what if? And if that doesn't satisfy you, then you have to go further.
Thanks.
So I know we're running close on time, so I just wanted, before going to the next questions, just to say, if you have to go, we understand. Hour by hour we work these days. Thursday morning at 10 o'clock, we have Arpad Sakalsky talking about fairground capitalism, another different perspective on all of these things. So if you can come back to that's great. I want to bring in, if I can at all, Ariana Introna, if you're still with us, for a question about grassroots organization. Would you like to speak up, Ariana?
Okay, yeah. Okay, yes. Thanks everyone for the amazing presentation and contributions. Yeah, my question was about whether you could tell us something about grassroots claimants organizing in the US, especially. So you were talking about issues of access, and so I'm part of a claimant solidarity group here, and we are in a, of course I'm in a different role, but the same issues and struggles around access in terms of accompanying claimants and so on and so forth recur. So I was wondering if you have come across, basically what scope for claimant solidarity and organizing exists in the US, and whether there are any strategies or tactics that you know about. Thanks.
Thanks. Ariana, can I ask, where are you doing your work? In Ireland?
Oh no, Scotland, so it would be the UK.
Okay, yeah, all right. I'm just curious where we're situated. There are, of course, grassroots organizing depends on the area. So grassroots organizing, there was a heyday of grassroots organizing and welfare, which has come and gone as there's very little welfare left. And organizing occurs around other things. But I think, to the extent I understand your question, I think that entering into these kinds of political questions through the vantage point of grassroots groups can be very illuminating. There are groups that are part of our study in Sweden and Denmark, which you know, they're the state, welfare state pretty much did it all, but not so much anymore, especially in Sweden and in the asylum area. A number of grassroots groups have formed, both as advocates and as providers of services to asylum. So understanding how they emerge as a mode, as an alternative to the state, forces you to ask, what else could this policy look, what other divergent realities are possible? This is, I find them fascinating because they create their own divergent reality of what asylum looks like in these grassroots groups. And it's very different from what the state looks like. So I think studying them can be very illuminating in terms of pursuing these divergent realities.
Great. I think we have time for just one more, and you know, maybe we have dinners to cook. I have one anyway, and you know, I was really struck. I can get in one point before the question. Chair's self-privileging, you know, but I was really struck by the semi-quote of von Clausewitz, the way policies are politics by other means, which is usually war by other means, which is really important to come back to the political elements of all of this, and it's not just simply an organizational administrative thing, but that politics are so central. And I suppose that's maybe, you know, so important to recall in all of this research. And then also now to bring in Adrienne with this question. Adrienne, are you still with us? Not on top of the tech here, am I?
I am, sorry. I just got to
shoot.
grab that all. Yeah, so thank you. It was a very interesting chat. Sorry.
Oh.
Really enjoyed that. So in my own research, I'm looking at the national level legal and political policies, constitutional amendments, and acts. So I'm really curious, are street level participants, are they ever engaged in your findings in this sort of policy negotiation? Is there any communication between the two parties, multiple parties, I suppose?
Interesting question. And I will say, you know, I'm looking at the links among all these levels. So I think that's a really, I spent a lot of time in Washington when I was doing one of my earlier projects where some of the reforms began there and worked their way through. So are they involved in the negotiations? They try to be. They want to be players at the table. And they go up as far as they can. Whether they are invited to a seat at the table depends on the policy issue, the organizations. Some organizations put a lot of effort into policy advocacy. That is different from the service-oriented ones who, you know, can barely stay afloat day to day providing services. So I think there's a lot of variation. So I suppose those that are actually street level providers tend to have less space for that, but they try through coalitions and so forth. It's probably not, and again, it depends on the policy area. It's interesting to see the refugee resettlement area organizations in the US. They basically lost all their funds when the last administration cut the entry of refugees precipitously. And now they're trying to get them back. So their policy advocacy is almost a matter of survival for them, as well as potentially for providing services. So I think the short answer is they try to be, but it depends on the area and sort of the orientation of the organization. I'm not sure that's so helpful, but that's the best I can say in short.
It was a very broad question, but thank you.
Yeah.
Summary.
Yeah, I mean, they don't. I'll tell you what I think they don't do, because I've given talks in Washington to the higher level policymakers on occasion. They don't bring their street level knowledge to the higher level. They do policy advocacy like everybody does it. right, about the details of the law and should it be, the shoulds, should it be this, should it be this. I haven't found them often to be very good at conveying how it really is. Does that, I don't know whether that's consistent with what you see. Adrian, is it?
I'm kind of right now looking at relational status and sort of how to avail of benefits in that regard. And sorry, the cat's jumping up on me. You can, not so much policy level, but in terms of movements and popular protest, I suppose, has created changes. So yeah.
Interesting.
Okay. So we're getting into the cat hour, and one more question here from Antoinette, who says that her mic isn't working. So the last question, I shall read. In your ethnographic work, did you encounter any resistance to IT systems or use of technology from street level organizations, or perhaps a speed over need approach to using the systems? So that's
the second. The second. You know, if you have to input something, you input it. If it doesn't allow you to input what you think is relevant, you input it anyway. So when you're out in the field, you ask people, what have you been doing all morning? And they will go, I'm cursing at this stupid IT system, which, forced me to have all these categories that don't make sense to what I do. But it was the same when it was paper, to be honest. It's not that it's IT that makes it problematic. It's this categorization into bureaucratic boxes that doesn't necessarily fit the types of things that people experience on the ground, or the diverse experiences of clients that all go into notes. They have a very, very sophisticated IT system for refugee housing in Sweden. And, I got a complete briefing on it, and it has all of these different elements, and the cost and the place and the number of people and the square meters and all of this stuff. And I said, well, yeah, but I've met people, they raise concerns about this particular circumstance with their children or being near a relative. Where does that go? And they go, oh, we have a section for that. There are notes. I said, does anybody read the notes? They said, probably not. So again, I don't know how different that is in terms of people being able to pay attention to these kinds of qualitative issues on paper either. I'm wondering, what is your experience?
I'm not behind that question as such, but we had very interesting conversation just last week with Lina Denkik about datification, and there's, at least with paper, you can scribble down notes at the side even or something, but with the computer, sometimes there's just no place. So the decision is made in the boxes, and if you don't tick the right boxes, suddenly you no longer exist. I was always delighted by Catch-22. There's a guy who's recorded as being dead, and then despite the fact of him being very much alive, he could not convince anybody of to the contrary. And I suppose that's the absurdity of it, but it's the absurd extension of a process which is so important and all of that. Okay, I suppose I better call it to a halt. We could keep going with this, but I'd just like to, I suppose, thank Evelyn and Mary and Joe and everybody for their questions and contributions. And we'll be back again on Thursday. So thank you all so very much, and great discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. I enjoyed it. Thank you all. It was great to meet you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.